Today's going to cover everything that you need for HopeFilled Financial FootStep number 4. And to get things started, I have a comical story of when an emergency fund came in handy for me, and it's when my radiator exploded. Believe me, you're not going to expect everything that happens in this story. Good morning and welcome to the HopeFilled Financial Podcast. My name is Jay Disberger, your one and only HopeFilled Financial Coach, and I'm happy that you're here with us today. As promised in the intro, today's whole episode is about emergency funds, and I'm going to get things started with what I think, in hindsight, is a pretty comical story of when I needed to use my emergency fund. Okay, so this story goes back to my last internship before I graduated school. My wife and I had just barely started dating. She was in Kansas working a program called Totus Tuus, moving around the state. And I was naturally in Salt Lake City. Now, one of the perks of this particular internship I was on was that housing was included for the summer. So here's the way that my boss handled getting me housing for this summer internship. There was a little development not too far from downtown where a friend of a friend or a client had this rental property. Now, the top part of the rental property was being rented out to, I think, 2 or 3 women. I didn't really talk to them much. But the basement was an Airbnb. And my boss had acquired the Airbnb for the full 3 months that I was interning. Now, the basement, I hate to say it, seemed a little jank. Seemed like the kitchen was MacGyvered together so that a otherwise normal basement could function as a full-blown Airbnb. Now, while I was on this internship, I was trying to build my experiment for my thesis in school, and so I needed a little bit of space. It was only a couple weeks into the summer, I decided I was going to rearrange the furniture. In doing so, to accommodate, again, me trying to build my thesis, I woke up the population that lived in the bed. That's right, there were bed bugs, but worse, the bed bug population that was living there from the previous individual who had rented out the Airbnb was being decimated by spiders. So I woke up the next morning with the telltale lines of bites that you see from bug bites, along with a series of other bites on both my arms with 2 little puncture holes. Those were spider bites. I got to work that morning a little bit late. My boss asked me what was up, and I told him that I wasn't quite feeling myself as I just found out that I had bed bugs and was suffering from a number of spider bites. He took one look at my arms and was like, that's not going to do, so we're going to move you. Later that day, all of my stuff was heat blasted with steam and parked in a car on the top of a hill. It was an incredibly hot summer, and I successfully managed to prevent any bed bugs from following me to my next location. I moved into a hotel temporarily for a couple days while my boss worked on getting my next housing arrangement, which, even though it was further away from the office, got me very excited, as the only place that my boss could find for the remainder of my internship was located in Park City. This was like a ski lodge area that was actually for sale. Someone was trying to sell it. It was part of a bigger building, think condo type development. My boss told me in the office, hey, I found this Airbnb in Park City. I think that's where I'm going to have you go. It's for sale, but what are the odds that it sells out from under you? So I pack up everything into my Infiniti G35 sedan again, and I drive 45 minutes from the office up to this Airbnb and get situated. And this thing was nice. It was newly renovated, and I couldn't have asked for a nicer place for any internship. It's really too bad that I didn't get to stay there that long. Now, it was while I was living here in the ski lodge sort of Airbnb that the exciting adventure with my radiator kicks in. Now, I mentioned at the start of the story that my wife and I had only just barely started dating, so we were calling each other frequently. She was going on a girls' trip this summer after finishing Totus Tuus, and for some reason, thought it would be a good idea to get up at 2 a.m. in order to start the drive to make it to their destination. I was worried sick about this because I was the typical new boyfriend, head over heels, over worried about everything, and I just didn't sleep that night. Which is funny because since being married, we've done much crazier things after midnight. Without digressing too far, one time we were in Wyoming. After having Oliver, we were traveling back from the holidays, and there was this big snowstorm coming in. We had made it to our hotel just barely at midnight. I had gotten just a tiny bit of sleep. Amanda was feeding Oliver and was looking at the storm and was like, hey, Jay, if we don't get up and leave now, we're going to get snowed in. So we ended up driving from like 1 a.m. to 7 a.m. from Wyoming through the edge of a snowstorm back to Salt Lake City. I digress. I didn't sleep that night because Amanda was getting up really early and I was worried about her safety in driving. She was fine. Nothing really happened on that trip. But when I got up for my 45-minute commute, I was tired. I was dead tired. And I just barely remembered to pack the lunch that I had that day. It was a can of tuna and an avocado. I was doing this keto diet thing, and that was what I had for lunch. You just take an avocado, hopefully it's really ripe. You cut it up into cubes, dump it into the bowl of tuna, you stir it up. That's all that you have for lunch. I was functioning okay throughout the morning. I had gotten my free office coffee and was going through my to-do list, but lunchtime rolled around and the lack of sleep was hitting me. I was trying to scoop the avocado out and it was extra ripe. And I ended up just getting avocado all over the front of my pants. It was embarrassing. I cleaned myself up as best I could, but you could still tell that I had just slopped avocado all over my slacks.
Oh, come on!
Okay, the rest of the workday was relatively uneventful. I survived, and I was getting ready for my final drive back to Park City. And here's the thing. It was one of the hottest days of the whole summer. It was over 100 degrees out. And when you drive from Salt Lake City up to Park City, you basically are driving from the bottom of the valley up into the heartland of ski country. You're going uphill on a highway, cranking 65 to 70 miles an hour, maybe 75 miles an hour for some stretches. I can't remember the speed limit. And it's hot. And I'm driving this 2004 Infiniti G35 going up the hill, and I turn one corner. I'm getting ready to pass a semi, and I punched the gas just to find that the vehicle was lacking power. It didn't have the jump, the go, the push that I was expecting. It was not responsive, which is not good coming from any car, let alone a sports sedan. So I looked down at the gauges as I'm driving, trying to figure it out, and I noticed that the little temperature gauge that tells you how hot things are running is almost in the red. And the more that I try to work the gas, the closer it gets. And I'm going like straight uphill. This thing is steep. I don't know if I'm going to make it. So I start slowing down. I go into the right lane. I put the hazards on. I'm trying to feather it a little bit so that as the temperature drops, for me not giving it too much gas, I can then get it going a little bit, get over another part of the hill. If it flattens out or dips a little bit as I'm working up the mountain, I could give it a break. And I made it just to the very peak, right before you come down a slope that eventually leads a couple exits down to where I was going to pull off and take a right turn to Park City. And it was right at the peak of that hill that the little temperature gauge went over to the red and the car had basically hit overheating. I had no idea what was wrong. I knew it was a hot day. I'd never seen this sort of behavior personally firsthand in a car. So I pull off onto this truck stop behind a semi, which has its front wide open and it's smoking. I get out and I go around to the front of the car. I press my pants up against the grill of the car as I'm working on getting the hood open. I'm tired. I'm a little delirious. And I didn't notice that the grill of the vehicle was covered with some sort of fluid all over, which mixed in nicely with the avocado to the point that if someone asked me, I didn't have to tell them that most of the stuff on me was avocado. It was radiator fluid. It was coolant. After I got the car open, it was very obvious that it was overheating. You could see things were steaming. And looking in and around the radiator, you could see that it was cracked. And out of that crack is where all the fluid had sprayed out onto the front of the car. So what am I supposed to do now? I am closer to making it back to my ski lodge Airbnb than I am turning around and going back to Salt Lake City and asking my friend Matthew, who lives in downtown, hey, can I get a ride or stay with you? I didn't know what was going to happen. And also, I had to get to work the next day. I don't have my car now. What am I supposed to do to get to work? I don't know anyone up in the Park City area to give me a ride, and I certainly didn't want to rent a car out of all this. And so here's one of the first things I did. I called Matthew and I told him about the situation. My car is toast. I'm calling a tow truck. I need you to come up to Park City, pick me up, and bring me back to downtown Salt Lake so that I can sleep in your apartment and walk to work with you. He's walking distance from the office. That way I don't miss a beat when it comes to work. And to thank Matthew, I told him that I was going to be dropped off by the tow truck driver at the grocery store next to my Airbnb. I was going to pick up some groceries and I was going to cook him a dinner. Matthew did not need me to do that in order to pull a favor, but he was very grateful because he didn't have any plans for dinner that evening. Next thing I did was call Amanda and explain everything that was going on. I don't remember if I got a hold of her or not. I may have left a weird message along the lines of, I am tired. I am covered in avocado and radiator fluid. My car is smoking by the side of the road. Call me when you get a chance." Because I was that kind of boyfriend. And in the mix of things, I had also called a tow truck and got them scheduled to take me to a gas station mechanic that was a little ways back. And while I waited for the tow truck, I talked to the semi-truck driver who was stopped in front of my car. Turns out that his vehicle, his truck, had overheated as well. We were both sort of in the same boat. Okay, so the tow truck driver picked me up. I get it to the gas station mechanic. They are wrapping up for the day. They said they'd look at it tomorrow, give me a call to tell me what happened. And he was courteous enough, the tow truck driver, to give me a ride back to that grocery store. I ended up buying, I think, like coconut milk and chicken and some other random stuff. And I hauled a whole bunch of grocery bags from the grocery store to the condo. I looked like Kevin McAllister in Home Alone. I had no idea what I was making for this dinner, but I put something together in the 30 minutes that I had before Matthew got there. The one thing I remember putting into the chicken, other than the chicken and the coconut and reducing the coconut whatever into a sauce, was that like every other action I had in the kitchen, I was yelling out some sort of obscure Jim Carrey line from a weird comedy movie.
I know there's a lot riding on it, but it's all psychological. Just got to stay in a positive frame of mind.
Matthew got there and he didn't seem to mind that most of the recipe was Jim Carrey quotes because he thought it was delicious. I quite frankly thought it was good too. It wasn't overcooked. It made for a good meal. And I was in good spirits, all things considered, because I had an emergency fund. No matter what this car was going to throw at me, I was going to be able to go back to that mechanic, that gas station mechanic, and I was going to be able to pay him to just fix the car. This was going to be a minor inconvenience that interrupted me for a couple days. How bad could it be? I've been through enough this summer. It can't get any worse. I stayed with Matthew for a day or two. They ended up replacing the radiator. They told me it was cracked open like a coconut. If I would have gotten an OEM radiator, it would have cost an arm and a leg. But they found an aftermarket one that was available for my vehicle, surprisingly, not too far away, and they were able to fix it for well less than what my emergency fund was, even as a college student on his last internship. Now, I don't want to leave any stone unturned. I got to fill you in. That apartment, that Airbnb, did sell out from under me that summer. So I ended up moving out of it into another ski lodge, which was significantly smaller. It was a studio with a Murphy bed. Shortly after moving into it, Amanda came up to visit me that summer. And I didn't want us to be sharing that space because we were only dating. So she stayed in that lodge, and I got myself a different Airbnb. It was like the upstairs attic for this older couple who had just started Airbnb slightly outside of Park City, Utah. The visit didn't last very long. I moved back into my studio for the last week of my internship. And while I was there, for that last week, the boiler in the building blew up. So I didn't have any water. No hot water, no cold water, no sink, no toilet, no nothing. So for every day that last week, I got up without having a restroom to go to, without having a shower, got into my car, drove my 45-minute commute, smelly and stinky from the night, getting into the office, in my pajamas, in my bedhead. I'd shower at the office, do my whole morning routine, and get to my desk. And I moved out before that thing was fixed, so I don't know how long it took for anyone else who was staying there. It's funny, the biggest inconveniences and the biggest roadblocks that I remember from that wild summer didn't actually tie to the car and the expense with the car and having to sacrifice in order to save up to accommodate the broken radiator. It more had to do with just the inconvenience of my time and having to move again and again and being eaten by spiders and not having running water for a week. And those were things that weren't in my control and things that I wasn't financially responsible for. So they didn't impact my emergency fund. But that's what we're going to talk about now. Your fully funded emergency fund. HopeFilled Financial FootStep number 4. HopeFilled Financial FootStep number 4 is saving 3 to 6 months of your expenses in a separate account for your emergency fund. This is savings that you do not touch for anything other than an emergency. And that's it. Until next week, until next Tuesday. Okay, believe it or not, there's a lot more to saving an emergency fund than just that. I want to talk about why it's important for the emergency fund to be 3 to 6 months of expenses. Most financial experts are going to tell you 3 to 6 months is the amount of savings that you need to mitigate risk that isn't deferred to something else. If you listen to the episode where I talked about the top 10 redundant insurance policies that I don't have and you likely don't need either, I sounded like a broken record. I said you don't need this if you have an emergency fund. The risk can be taken on by you if you have a fully funded emergency fund. You do not need to pay insurance to cover it. You can if you want to for some of those policies, but they're not needs, they're wants. So you don't need the policies. And while we're talking about insurance, that's one thing that you want your fully funded emergency fund to mitigate. That's going to be your deductible on insurance, primarily your health insurance deductible. When you have a fully funded emergency fund, you can afford to raise your medical deductible to something that fits within your emergency fund that can help you reduce your premium and reduce your overall exposure to expense for health insurance or a health insurance equivalent like a cost sharing ministry or a health sharing ministry. We've talked about that on a past episode as well. I like to think of an emergency fund as something that can cover not only the full deductible equivalent for my HCSM, but also my auto insurance deductible. If me and my family are in a car accident, we can pay our auto insurance deductible for the accident and know that regardless of the kind of treatment that we're going to need following the car accident, that we are covered, that I have the cash to be able to cover that emergency in that moment. And that would be an emergency. That would be a tragedy. That would be a life-altering event. Financial experts are also going to tell you that an emergency fund, a fully funded emergency fund, should be able to bridge the gap in between job situations. If you get laid off or you get fired, it's going to take you some time to get hired again or find another source of income. During that time, you still need to make ends meet. So how long does it take you to get that new job in place? On average, if you're out there hunting for it, 3 to 6 months should have you covered. Now, 3 to 6 months, this is a pretty big range. How do you know if you should be closer to the 3 months or the 6 months? And this is where I like to introduce a little bit more nuance with HopeFilled Financial FootStep number 4 that you might not be able to find from someone else out there talking about money. If you're following the HopeFilled Financial Footsteps, in footstep number 1, you saved up your starter emergency fund, which is just enough to fend off the ankle biters while you're getting out of debt. It's going to be somewhere for most of you between $1,000 and $4,000, probably no more than a month's worth of expenses. You're also out of consumer debt right now, so you no longer have a lot of debt payments that are taking away your income. You can focus that freed up income power to saving into your emergency fund. Your starter emergency fund, if it wasn't already a month, can be added onto to hit the first milestone, which will be 1 month's worth of expenses saved. While you're getting to that first month, I want you to hit it with the same sort of intensity that you did when you were working the debt snowball in HopeFilled Financial Footstep number 3. Think of it like this. If you ran into a big emergency that required you to take out more debt, you'd be going back into debt. You'd be kicked back to HopeFilled Financial Footstep number 3. You don't want to go back. You got to go at this with some serious focus. Okay, so we get to that first month. The next milestone is going to be 3 months worth. That's only 2 more months. Let's say by getting out of debt, you've freed up 1/4 of your income. If you have really cut back on your wants and you're only covering your needs, you're going after it intensely. 1/4 of your income. If all of your income represented a month's worth of expenses, which isn't necessarily the case, you only need to cover your need expenses when it comes to your emergency fund, not your 3 to 6 months of income. It's 3 to 6 months of your expenses. Let's make that clear. At worst, to save up 2 more months of expenses, it'll take you 8 months. That means to get to the 3 months of emergency funds saved, after you finish HopeFilled Financial Footstep number 3, you should be able to manage that with 1 year or less of focus. If you're able to go and throw on some more snowflakes, selling stuff, or earning extra income in order to accelerate this part. Okay, you've made it through to the 3 months emergency fund. It's at this point that we need to evaluate, is 3 months enough for your emergency fund, enough that you can move on to the next footstep? Or do you still need to be working closer to the 6-month fully funded emergency fund? And that's going to really boil down to your specific circumstances. I'll give you a couple rules of thumb that help a lot of people gauge whether they're closer to 3 or 6 months. Imagine this scenario. you're in a family, you're married, there are two people who are working, they bring in about the same amount of income. If one spouse loses their job, the other can continue to work. There's redundancy for the income. So you're not completely out of luck and dependent upon your emergency fund if someone needs to go find new work. This means that you don't need to have as much as someone who has just one breadwinner who's bringing everything, and there's no redundancy to the income. And the same kind of metric can be true if you have kids or no kids. If you have a lot of kids, there's probably a lot more propensity for a trip to the ER for a broken arm from a sporting event. Meanwhile, if you don't have any kids and you're young and you're healthy, you don't have a lot of medical stuff that comes up, you probably are less likely to run into a health emergency. We can even get granular enough to say that your type of employment can vary what sort of emergency fund you need to feel comfortable. For some jobs, if you were unemployed, you could go find work within a week or two because you're in high demand. But there are some jobs where the demand is much lower, and it might take a few weeks or months to replace your job. And you might have to move to find a new employer. You might need to go across the country to get that new work. If the latter is true, a higher emergency fund is for you. Now, notice that I mentioned what kind of emergency fund makes you feel comfortable. Ultimately, the emergency fund that's right for you is the one that's going to allow you to sleep at night. And it's the one that's not going to delay you from moving forward with your hope-filled financial journey. It's the one that's not going to stop you from fully engaging with your investment journey to plan for retirement. One thing that might really help you, if you need more than 3 months, but you don't want to be so focused and intense for more than a year to build your emergency fund, you can do something like this. Get your 3 months and then slow down a lot. Slow down a lot. And just say, I'm going to take a fair chunk of money and continue to add it to the emergency fund over a longer period of time. Say, cut your contributions to what it was in half. It might take you a couple years, maybe 3 years, to get all the way up to 6 months. But you can do that while focusing on other financial goals. And you know that you have enough emergency fund that you're going to be able to cover the bulk of what comes hitting you. It's fully funded. And you don't have to stop contributing to the emergency fund until you get much closer to that 6 months of expenses. Once you hit that much in your savings that's set aside for emergencies explicitly, it's not being invested, it's not growing, it's boring. If you start to go beyond that, you're going to be sidelining cash that could be working for you and mitigating risk that you might not need to mitigate. Now, depending on your circumstances, you might need to pile up more money. You might know of a certain event that's coming that can suck up more than 6 months worth of expenses, but that's separate from the HopeFilled Financial FootSteps. That's separate from the general journey. That is a particular circumstance where you can see a storm coming and you need to do everything in your power to prepare for it. Okay, I have a Forbes article I want to share with you, but before we do, I want to ask, where do you store your emergency fund? Well, 3 to 6 months of expenses is a lot of cash. And quite frankly, for me personally, I have a hard time leaving that in a savings account that's earning next to nothing at my brick and mortar bank, which is why I personally keep my emergency fund in a high yield savings account. In a high yield savings account, that money is liquid enough that I can access it in the case of an absolute emergency. Now, I do have some money that's liquid available at my brick and mortar credit union's savings account. That is not high yield. If I needed real quick cash, I could access that by opening up my credit union banking app and pushing a button. It's instantly available through my debit card, just right there. But if I needed to access the fully funded emergency fund, I'm going to need a day or two to transfer that money over so I can access it and pay for the emergency. That, in most cases, is going to be okay. And in a high yield savings account, you're going to be able to earn enough money to offset a good chunk of inflation, if not all of it, depending on the account and depending on what interest rates are running right now from the Fed. Okay, so here's what we're going to do now. We're going to go through this article from Forbes, which talks about why a 6-month emergency fund may be too much for you. This article is written by Bernadette Joy. She is a financial coach contributor to Forbes, and I thought it would be really interesting to get her opinion on the high side of fully funded emergency funds. The article starts by saying, when deciding how much to save for emergencies, A rule of thumb often recommended by financial experts is to save 3 to 6 months worth of living expenses or more, depending on your needs and goals. However, according to recent survey data, 53% of Americans don't have an emergency fund at all. Reaching 6 months of living expenses in your savings is even more difficult with inflation and higher interest rates on debt. Okay, a couple quick things to note. It's hard to save up for a fully funded emergency fund when you're drowning in debt. That's why we get out of consumer debt before going whole hog on saving up the emergency fund. We get the starter emergency fund established, get rid of the debt, then move on to the fully funded emergency fund. And it's wild that 53% of Americans do not have an emergency fund at all. In order to accommodate emergencies without an emergency fund, I bet a lot of people rely on going to a credit card, taking out debt in order to cover that emergency. And if you use high interest debt, like credit card debt, you can take a brief emergency that could have been an inconvenience if you had a fully funded emergency fund and transfer it into a nightmare, a financial nightmare, a crisis, because you have so much more interest that you have to pay on this. You are paying through the ears for the privilege of using debt to cover an emergency. The article continues, as a financial coach, suggesting a 6-month emergency fund to my students increased their feelings of hopelessness when they are already strapped for cash.
You're stealing people's hope.
Plus, a surprising number of students who had saved up more than 6 months' living expenses were afraid to use the excess money to increase their wealth. This plays into 2 points of view that we didn't talk about. One is Dave Ramsey's perspective that if you give someone a goal that looks unrealistic or doesn't have enough bells and whistles on it, that they lose hope. They are no longer inspired to engage with the plan, which is why it can be really helpful to do the same thing that the debt snowball does for your debt journey for saving up your emergency fund. Start with the goal of the 1 month's worth of expenses, then the 3 months, and then from 3 to 6 months, cut back your intensity and make it something that feels a little bit more automatic and allow yourself some freedom to engage with other goals. If you've already reached saving for 6 months of expenses or plan to, consider the following tips first. If you follow the rule of thumb of 3 to 6 months worth of living expenses, the range would be $16,732 to $33,464. A very large difference for many people. Yeah, it's a big range. It's impossible to predict all of the possible scenarios that could require using your emergency fund. And it would certainly be helpful to have more cash on hand should something catastrophic like a major home repair or medical emergency occur. In my engineering career, I calculate loads on electrical panels. Now, the National Electrical Code, the NEC, allows you to use a diversification factor for certain types of loads because not every single outlet, for example, in a hotel is going to have a vacuum cleaner plugged into it. That's just wildly unlikely to happen. So you can basically derate the odds that you're going to have every emergency happening to you all at once. The article continues, but it's important to ask yourself, what else could I do to create more financial stability with the thousands of dollars sitting idly? It's also important to consider if having too much cash saved creates complacency in your current financial career position versus taking a more proactive approach to grow your income. I hadn't thought about an emergency fund being something that can leave you to feeling complacent. Let me know what you think about that in the comments. Okay, the next part of the article I'm going to skip because it basically says that you should consider paying off your high interest debts before you hoard cash, before you build a fully funded emergency fund. And that's already built into the HopeFilled Financial FootSteps. And I'll add that there's a reference to the budgeting app Mint, which, to my knowledge, has shut down. Rest in peace, Mint.
You're not mad at me?
No,
You're sure?
I'm fine.
Okay, cool, because I thought...
The next part of the article is an interesting point, which says that you probably don't need to have as much of an emergency fund if you have your resume brushed up and ready to go and you've been practicing your interviewing skills. That way, you are more of an interviewing machine if you were to lose your job and had to go find more employment. This can cut back on the time between you and finding a new job, reducing the need that you have for an emergency fund. This is a very interesting perspective and one that I hadn't thought about personally before reading this article. So I think it's a good point. And I'd, again, be curious to know what you think of it. For me, I'd be okay reducing an emergency fund as a result of this exercise as long as it doesn't drop below things like my medical and auto deductibles. The last part of the article really gets into an interesting point, and I want to throw up some red flags. Don't delay investing into a Roth IRA. One of the common misconceptions Americans have about retirement accounts is once you contribute money, you can't withdraw it without extra taxes or penalties. For 2023, you can contribute up to $6,500 and an extra $1,000 if you're at least 50 years old. With a Roth IRA, you've already paid income tax on the funds you've contributed. After you contribute the money to it, you can withdraw the original contributions at any time without paying any penalty or tax. This is true. This is a true point, and it's one that I don't bring up as an option readily. Not one that I like to bring up as the first option for emergency savings, because that money is dedicated, it's earmarked to growing for your retirement future. If you were to have an emergency where, heaven forbid, you have to pull money out of your retirement accounts with or without taxes and penalties in order to accommodate it, you're robbing your future and you're setting yourself back. Really, a proper emergency fund not only mitigates you from risk of needing to go back into debt, but it mitigates the risk of needing to tap into your investments. It's possible that if you invest it, say in a taxable account, or even, as the article recommended here, in a Roth IRA, knowing that you can pull it back out, your investment can dip in value when it's invested. It's volatile. When it's in a high-yield savings account, it's only going to grow. So if you have an emergency and your emergency fund is invested, but the market is down, which means you're much more likely to run into a job crisis, well, you don't have near the savings that you thought you did. That destroys the point of having an emergency fund. Needless to say, while this is creative and it can work for someone in a pinch when all other options are exhausted, I'm not a fan of this as being a default. While in most cases you must wait until 59 and a half years of age to withdraw any earnings without additional taxes or penalty, there are several circumstances that the IRS allows you to withdraw early and avoid the extra cost. These reasons can include disability, certain medical expenses, health insurance costs while unemployed, and having a child. Rather than keep a full 6 months of living expenses in a savings account that doesn't earn much interest, you may opt to stash a portion into your Roth IRA where it can grow tax-free. Now that I exceed the income limits to be eligible for a Roth IRA, I regret not having contributed more when I could. And I think we're going to leave the article there. I disagree that you should consider Roth IRAs as default for storing your emergency fund just by the volatile nature of the markets. I think you're going to find a lot more peace if you're able to cleanly separate your emergency fund that protects your investments and protects you and your retirement investing, something that rides a roller coaster. Now, I'm going to wrap up this episode by sharing a brief clip from the Money Guys show. I love the Money Guys. They are brilliant. They're doing God's good work, helping grow financial literacy in a healthy and intentional way. I'm going to surprise you now by basically sharing a point that will bleed into not only next week's episode, but a point where I might disagree with the Money Guys. And as a disclaimer, I am not the individual who sent this question in.
All right, Jay has a question. He says, when does it make sense to have more than 3 to 6 months of an emergency fund? I'm currently maxing out my 401k, Roth, and HSA, so good for you there. Should I save more in my emergency fund? Or, to add to this a little bit, should I be paying off my mortgage? So how do you decide, where this extra savings should go?
Even though I wasn't the Jay who asked this question, it is somewhat similar to what I had to ask Dave Ramsey on the whole 8% kerfuffle.
So the question is, when does it make sense to have more than 3 to 6 months? Brian, I'm gonna take the real easy one. I'll leave some of the more fun ones for you. The real easy one is one of the most common times when we need a larger emergency fund than normal, a larger fund than 3 to 6 months of our living expenses, is as we're moving towards a transition where we're potentially walking away from the workforce, as we're preparing for retirement, as we're preparing for financial independence, as we're moving into that place where we're going to live off of the resources that we're accumulated. We're going to count on our army of dollar bills to provide for us. We probably need to have a bigger emergency fund. We tell a lot of our retirees or soon-to-be retirees, you might actually need an emergency fund somewhere between 12 to 18 to 24 24 months of liquid capital readily available, so that no matter what market environment you enter into, if you retire and then COVID happens, or you retire and then 2022 happens, you know that you have a big enough emergency fund that you can pull off of those pots of money without having to sell assets at depressed prices. So,
and that right there is the main focus of this particular Money Guys clip. I'll link it in the description below. They say that when you move into retirement, an emergency fund should grow from that 3 to 6 months of expenses all the way up to 24 months of expenses, or 2 whole years worth of expenses. Reason being, if the markets have a major problem, you have some cash reserves that you can live off of instead of living off of your distribution strategy. This is something that I've heard of before. This is something that I have heard from Dave Ramsey's team when I was going through Financial Coach Master Training, and I'm going to share a lot more about that next week. If you implement a strategy in retirement where you have a large bucket of cash that you pull from, well, the rest of the nest egg is invested, that's somewhat known as the 2 or even 3 bucket strategy, depending on how you flow chart out the system. And the whole point of the strategy, just like they said on the clip, if the market is down, you can live off of your cash reserves when it's inefficient to pull stuff from the market, which is kind of the idea of having an emergency fund when you're working, so you don't have to tap into your investments, right? You can use that cash when the market's down, live off of it until the market recovers, then go back to your otherwise default distribution strategy. And while I can see how this emotionally can help a retiree feel more confident and comfortable with the situation that they're in and the strategy they're implementing, there's a real question on, have you exceeded the point of diminishing returns? Are you sidelining too much money to sit there to do nothing? And is it going to ultimately reduce the odds that you can survive retirement if you sideline 2 whole years worth of cash? I mean, think about it. 2 years worth of expenses is a lot. And for this week, I want to end the episode with that thought. I want you to be thinking about, until next Tuesday, how much money is too much to sideline when I'm in retirement? Is the 3 to 6 months emergency fund still acceptable for retirement, or do I really need to up it? And if I need to up it, how far? And is the bucket strategy, where I keep 1 to 2 years in cash for when the market's down, is it more viable when paired with other strategies? Is it something that can really enhance my retirement plan? Or is it something that just makes us feel good, even though it's mathematically inferior? If you're looking for my opinion, you're going to have to wait till next week to find out. So until next week, until next Tuesday, budget bravely and enjoy your hope-filled financial future.